Welcome to another edition of Ask Schmehl. We're at Charlotte Sports Park in beautiful Port Charlotte, home of the Tampa Bay Rays spring training facility, where we just got done with an 11-2 win by the Detroit Tigers today. You can read the story on mlive.com/Tigers, and largely that win was because of Nick Castellanos, which brings us to our first question by Blake and our first Ask Schmehl question, who asks if there's any relation between Nick Castellanos, the Tigers' highly touted prospect, and Alex Castellanos, the Dodgers' AAA prospect. And Blake, to answer your question, I didn't know, so I had to go to Nick himself. He tried to pull it off as though Alex was his twin, but alas, there is no relationship whatsoever. They're both from Florida, they're both Cuban, but that's where it ends. Our next question comes from Jimbo. Jimbo asks if there's a legitimate shot that Don Kelly can win a spot on the Tigers' 25-man roster. And Jimbo, it's a really interesting question, and to be honest with you, we just spoke to Jim Leland in the post-game conference about it. He's very impressed with what Don Kelly has done at the plate so far. Obviously, it's still early. There are only 7 games into spring, but to be honest with you, Jim likes what Don Kelly can use and do with his versatility. He can be that late-inning defensive replacement. He can play third base, he can play first base, and if needed, they can put him in left field in the event Andy Dirks is hurt or something along those lines. But to be honest with you, the one thing holding him back is his offense. He has struggled at the plate. He's a left-handed hitter, and the Tigers need a right-handed bat to platoon with Andy Dirks in left field. Now, that be the case, Don Kelly does have an opt-out clause in his contract, so if he doesn't make the Tigers' 25-man roster out of spring, he can opt to be removed from that contract and look elsewhere. And he did garner a lot of attention this spring and this offseason from other teams, so if he did make the 25-man roster, it wouldn't be a surprise if he did decide to look elsewhere. Our final question comes from Joseph, and Joseph wants to know if there's a legitimate shot that the Tigers decide to trade Max Scherzer at the end of this season. And Joseph, that's a really interesting question, only because you know money is definitely going to come into play when it comes to this. Max Scherzer just signed a 1-year deal with the Tigers to avoid arbitration. He's earning $6.75 million. That's up $3 million from what he made last year. And obviously, he's still under team control for 1 more year, so if he was to go into arbitration next offseason, there's a strong likelihood that he could be making anywhere up to $9 million. And that be the case, the Tigers did speak with him briefly about a long-term contract last offseason. They instead decided to hammer out a 1-year deal. But if they were to go into this offseason, it wouldn't be surprising if the Tigers address him about a long-term deal again. That be the case, he is represented by Scott Boras. Scott Boras is notorious for wanting his players to go into free agency in order to maximize their value. Now, the big question mark that you ask is whether or not they trade him. I don't see it happening, only because the Tigers have just invested $155 million into this payroll, and if they don't win the World Series this year, they still have a strong core coming back together next year. That be the case, 2013, if they were to find themselves well out of the race around the All-Star break, could they trade him? Perhaps. I just don't see it happening. I see Max Scherzer instead entering free agency at the end of his contract in 2014, that offseason, and that'll be a big question mark for whether or not he'll come back to the Tigers. To be honest with you, it's going to cost him a lot of money. You can bet that Scott Boras is going to want to get the most out of that. So that's all your questions right now for Ask Schmehl. For more, go to mlive.com/Tigers. We appreciate it if you've got more questions. Be sure to submit them. Just use in the subject hit Ask Schmehl. Thanks a lot. See you soon.